David Weinberger, please explain to us why everything is miscellaneous.
Thank you very much. Everything's miscellaneous because everything actually is miscellaneous. And the reason why I think this is worth talking about is that for a long time, on the order of millennia, we've assumed that knowledge stops at the miscellaneous. That when you get down to the miscellaneous, that's the stuff you couldn't classify anymore or categorize. So that's stuff not worth knowing or not knowable. I think what's going on now is that we're beginning to find that knowledge actually begins with the miscellaneous. That there's, I think, possibly a large change in what constitutes knowledge. And that's what I want to talk about with you tonight. And I'm honored and privileged to be able to do this. So thank you very much. You know, we've been digitizing information. You may have noticed that sort of a worldwide effort to bring things online. It's been going pretty well, you know, hundreds of billions of pages, so it's going pretty well. But as we do that, we're discovering that the principles by which we order, categorize, classify, arrange, organize stuff, understand stuff, that the principles that we've used for doing that developed in the real world, obviously. And it turns out that they are also limited by the real world. As we bring things online, the techniques by which we organize them, we're having to invent new principles that frequently invalidate the old principles. But the old principles are deeply tied to the question of what knowledge is. In fact, what knowledge is has been basically how we organize it and categorize it. So that's a big change, and it's worth noticing, and I think worth spending some time on. So that's what I want to talk about. The state of knowledge is, I think it's not going too far to say that knowledge is in trouble. It's had a nice run, but there are cracks in the foundation. And you can see sort of little indications of them. And these are all little indications all over the place. These are cracks in knowledge and cracks in authority, since authority and knowledge have gone together in important ways. So, you know, ask Dan Rather, who was 19 minutes into his presentation before the first bloggers were raising questions about the documents he was talking about. He was still on air. So that's a little crack in what constitutes an authority. Think about the role that news has traditionally played and how skeptical we are of it now. In fact, this guy, Jon Stewart, is by many accounts the best journalist on TV. He's a comedian. And frankly, I would not argue with that characterization of him. That's a crack in authority and a crack in knowledge. Farnaz Fasihi is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She reports from Baghdad. She wrote an email that got heavily blogged, you know, web-blogged, that talked in a more personal voice about what's going on in Baghdad. And in some ways, more truth emerged from this than what emerges from the gray pages of the great newspapers. Because this was written in a real human voice. Newspaper journalism has learned, it's the technique of stripping voice from stories. This piece that showed up in email that talked about her actual experiences was fascinating. She's a wonderful writer, and it was in her own voice. Third and final sort of crack in knowledge that should have us wondering if something big is going on here is the Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a fantastic site, and it sounds like a completely ridiculous experiment, but it's worked. Wikipedia is a bottom-up encyclopedia. And encyclopedias traditionally are where knowledge goes to live. The encyclopedists in the 17th century were defining knowledge. These were the authorities that you went to. They were coalescing it all in between covers. Wikipedia, anybody can create an entry. Anybody who has access to the web. And if you're reading an entry and you think it's wrong or one-sided, you want to fix it up, go ahead. One button click, and you're now typing into the encyclopedia. So this would sound like it must be bound to draw all the worst elements of the web. This would be a magnet for misinformation, disinformation, for lies, slander, gossip, this tinfoil hat ideas. Turns out it's actually pretty good. It's 1 million articles so far, and generally pretty good. And it's only going to get better. That's a big change in what constitutes the authority of knowledge. So knowledge began, as you know, with the Greeks. At least that's generally where you trace it back to. This is the Agora. This is the idealized view of it. And this is how it actually looks now. And somewhere in between is the truth. And in the Agora, anybody could stand up and argue for how the city-state should be directed. Matters of life and death. There's bodily decisions. Am I going to die in a war? Am I going to have enough food to eat? What's going to happen to my children? anybody could stand up, where anybody means any property-owning adult white male. But within that constriction, it's anybody. Birthplace of democracy. So, burning question arises. Here we have people who are arguing different sides of an issue. Which ones of these should we believe? What are beliefs worthy of being believed? And that would be knowledge. Knowledge was born out of this bodily involvement, this context, where you were at issue and your children were at issue. So Plato, as I'm sure you know, said, well, let's see, what's knowledge? Knowledge is not just true belief, but it's justified true belief, stuff you're justified in believing. And that began 2,500 years of inquiry into, well, what constitutes justification? And over time, generally, the range of knowledge got narrower and narrower. The range of justification got tighter and tighter. The stranglehold on knowledge got tighter and tighter. So it began with, well, you knew about the stuff you needed to know in order to do your craft or to guide the ship of state. That was what knowledge was about. And it got narrowed. It was stuff that you could prove through logic. And it got narrowed. It was stuff you could prove or know through faith. It got narrowed. It was stuff that you knew through math. Until 1600s, we get this guy, René Descartes, who narrowed knowledge down to a single sentence that even God couldn't trick him about. I think, therefore I am. And while Descartes then used that as a foundation to expand what we know, nevertheless, this extremely narrow rationalistic view of what knowledge is has stayed with us. So even Descartes stopped thinking 1650 and was no more. Nevertheless, after that, we still have much of his attitude towards knowledge embedded in us. So what started out as lively discussions among concerned citizens about how their state would proceed and what would happen to them as embodied individuals, that's been narrowed and narrowed and narrowed until what constitutes knowledge, it's an anorexic view of knowledge, where experts in increasingly small slices have authority over some segment of a discipline, and increasingly abstracted from the human context. Well, Aristotle was the first to enunciate the shape of knowledge. He discerned it. Didn't invent it, he discerned it. And he was asking a question like, what does it mean to know what a robin is? And decided that there are 10 categories of knowledge about anything. Basically 10 questions you can ask about anything. But he was particularly interested in one, which is, what is it? Because that's the fundamental question. So he said, well, if you don't know that a robin is a bird, you really don't know what a robin is. Knowledge has something to do with ordering, classifying, categorizing. It has to do with lumping and splitting. So to know that a robin is a bird is to put it together, to lump it with all the other birds, and to split it off from those other birds by how it's different from them. What makes something a bird is that it's a feathered biped. If you've got 2 legs and you got feathers, you're a bird. That is a way of both gathering together and splitting apart. And that strategy of knowing what something is by seeing what it's like and how it's different from other things has lasted for 2,500 years. It's an incredibly powerful way of comprehending large, complex things like the universe. It's amazingly powerful. Now, I've drawn this here. It looks like a tree that we're very familiar with, org charts and the like. An inverted tree, the roots at the bottom, but a branching structure. Aristotle actually didn't picture it that way. It took 500 years for somebody to do that, and that was Porphyry, a Syrian philosopher, who actually first drew Aristotle's categories as a tree, represented them graphically as a tree. But that tree-like thinking has stuck with us, firmly embedded in our brains. There are 2 premises of Aristotle's I want to mention really briefly because they bear directly on what's happening in the digital world. The first is the notion, as I said at the beginning, that knowledge ends where miscellany begins, where the miscellaneous begins. So for example, you do your laundry, and you have everything lumped together. It's one big lump. And then you engage in the basic act of categorizing, which is to split and then lump and split and lump. So we split this into a set of lumps. Shirts, which are lumped together, even though the green one's different than the red one, and socks, even though they're different colors, different weights. So we're lumping and splitting. This is how we manage in our lives. This is how we organize and understand our world. But then you get to a point where you're putting away, say, your socks, and this is my sock drawer. This sock drawer has no organizing principle. It is miscellaneous. I could, I suppose, organize it by weight or color or something like that, but I don't. From Aristotle's point of view and Greek point of view, there's no knowledge possible of this sock drawer because it's too miscellaneous. Knowledge ends at my sock drawer. It ends at the miscellaneous. Second premise of Aristotle and the Greeks in general is that, well, of course, knowledge and the world are the same shape. Knowledge is of the world, and if it were a different shape or order or organization of the world, then it wouldn't really be knowledge of the world. It would be a mistake about the world. So knowledge and the world are essentially the same in how they're organized. Which brings us straight to Melville Dewey, the creator of the Dewey Decimal System, 1876, he published it. This was an attempt by Dewey to organize knowledge so that libraries, the geography of libraries, could represent, have the same geography as the landscape of knowledge. So we'd cluster stuff together by topic. And Dewey came up with 10 categories. Each have 100 numbers. And within them, all of human knowledge can be arrayed. So if you look at the 200, which is religion and theology, you have to get down to 296. There are 88 of the numbers, of the 100 numbers in that category, are assigned to Christian topics. 296, Judaism, one number for Judaism. 297, Islam and religions originating in it, one number for Islam. And Buddhists, to the right of the decimal point. They didn't make it into the whole numbers. So something's peculiar about this. It's clearly a reflection of Dewey's somewhat naive, he was just out of college when he did this, a somewhat naive view of what the structure of knowledge is. It's highly based in his cultural context, a cultural context that in a pluralistic society we no longer hold to. So why don't the owners of the Dewey Decimal System, the OCLC, fix it? These are reasonable people. These are not people who are out to enforce some religious point of view. Why don't they fix it? It's tweaked all the time. And there's a very good reason why they don't fix it. It's because books are in the real world. In order to fix it, you could not find enough razor blades. You'd have to send out thousands of librarians with razor blades to scrape the white ink off the backs of the books and then write in the new classification numbers. And as soon as they were done updating it to get rid of this Christian bias, you'd start hearing from, say, the Sunnis and the Shiites who are arguing over whether they should be at the same level. And what are the Baha'is doing there? And the Jews for Jesus and the Scientologists, what level should they be at? You would have a never-ending series of arguments in all the categories. And you'd have librarians all the time going out doing nothing but scraping white ink off the backs of spines. This is not a soluble problem. It is not the case that there is a right Dewey Decimal System that will satisfy everybody across all cultures for all time, or even for an instant. It is not a soluble problem. The problem is that there is no such thing as a universal taxonomy, and this is despite what Aristotle would have thought. So now we're in the process of digitizing everything. That's a big change, and I think you can see it as being a third order in addition to the first two. I think it may be useful, but you'll let me know, to think about this as having, of us as having three orders of organization. And in the first two are very familiar, and they're, I think, well symbolized by the Bettman Archive, which, as you know, is the nation's most prestigious collection, perhaps, of historic photographs. 11 million photographs. Bill Gates bought the Bettman in the 90s, and in 2001 he moved it from where it was melting, literally melting in Manhattan, to a cave, a set of caverns, 220 feet underground in the central Pennsylvania, limestone quarries. The Bettman consists of two caverns, a front one and a back one. In the back one, you get the first order of organization, where you actually organize physical things. The photographs in the filing cabinets. It goes on forever, by the way. It's a hugely long cavern. It's being lowered to -2 degrees over time in order to keep it preserved. So you actually have to bundle up. There's a climate change involved in going into this place. So here's the first order of organization, where the things themselves are organized. In the second order, it's the front cavern, which is where the card catalogs are. Very familiar card catalogs. And in the second order, what you do is you take a physical representation of the metadata, that is information about the objects that you're filing in the first order. The books on the shelves, second order, is the card catalog. You move those separate from the books and you put them into, say, a card catalog where you have many advantages, including the fact that you can organize the card catalog differently than you organize the books on the shelves. Right? So Dewey organizes by topic, and the card catalog may be alphabetical by author. Also, I've been told there's something like 560 miles of shelves in the Library of Congress. That's a lot of walking. It's a lot faster to walk through the card catalog. So there are obvious and big advantages to using the second order scheme. It works really well. But now, as we move the actual contents online, as the information itself is moving online, we can ask a really important question, which is, okay, now, what can we do easily with digital information that the real world makes hard, that the real world requires you to send out people with razor blades for? What can we do with this opportunity? And I'd like to point briefly at 4 different changes. The first is that the basic act of lumping and splitting in the real world means that you make a decision about where you're going to put your socks. You're going through your laundry, and are you going to put this pair into the sock pile or into the shirt pile? You can't do both. That's the fundamental thing about lumping and splitting. The stuff only goes in one lump. So if you had a real-world store and you had a new digital camera and you wanted to put it somewhere, very likely you would categorize it under photographic equipment. If this were a website, if you're doing this online, absolutely you wouldn't just do it in one category. You do it in as many categories as possible. It's to your advantage to have it show up every place that somebody might be looking for digital cameras. You can have a leaf on many branches. The fundamental act of lumping and splitting has just been violated. Second of all, in the real world, in first and second orders, what you want is neat classification schemes. Dewey is very neat and simple. All right, it's a branching structure. You want to have it neat and clean and clear and unambiguous, whereas on the web or in other digital environments, you absolutely want as much mess as possible. You want to have this camera linked all over the place. The more links, the more value. Messiness is a virtue on the web. Third, in the real world organization, first and second order, the person who owns the information generally owns the organization of that information because they're moving the thing around, so it better be the owner. So if you went into a clothing store and you said, you know what, I'd like to see all of the clothing in this store that's in my size, I'm just going to grab it here, I'm going to make a big pile of my stuff, you'll be frog-walked out of the store before you got more than 3 items in your hand. You can't do that because the store owns the organization of that information. Online, absolutely. Not only you should demand to be able to order that information the way that you want, because the owner of the information no longer owns the organization of that information. So for example, this is a site called Newegg. It's one of many online stores that lets you do this. When you go there and you look for digital cameras, they will show you what they think, they'll show you their preferred order, which happens to feature the camera they're pushing this week. And that's fine. Sure, why not? But if you look on the left-hand side, there's a place for you to say what you care about. I don't care what type of memory stick, but I do care about the manufacturer and the number of megapixels. Click that, and now the store reorganizes itself around your needs, around your interests. You own the organization of that store, if you want to. We take this for granted now, and if we're not, and Amazon's a fantastic example of this, by the way. It will very quickly get to the point, if you're doing online shopping, you're not allowed to do this, it will seem like a very old-fashioned online store. The fourth of these changes is that not only do the users get to organize the information, but the users now can contribute to the information. And in fact, sometimes that's the only way to get the information in. So for example, we will all have tens of thousands of digital photos on our hard drives within the next few years, certainly within the next 10 years. And when you upload from your camera onto your computer, you will see a listing of file names that's closed. It's computer gibberish. It's dsc0002.jpg. Well, that's fine, except in 10 years, when you're trying to find the picture you took 10 years ago of Aunt Millie on the beach, you're not really going to remember what DSC00 number it was. This is going to be more and more of a problem. There are various attempts to solve it, but one of them is really interesting. It's called social tagging. And the idea is that, and this is now being done, at least occasionally at some conferences, they take the conference photos, they put them up on a website, and they invite conference attendees to browse through them, and when they recognize somebody, particularly themselves, because egotism certainly counts, type in the name. And so you distribute the task of tagging thousands of photos across a group that's at least as large. And now you can start to get this stuff tagged. In terms of personal photographs, as our photographs on our hard drives become more and more networked, as we're sharing them with relatives and friends, the same sort of social tagging will take place. So now we have users who, just in this one little example, actually get to add to the richness of these objects by putting in their own information, in this case, identifying people and events. So I think that this means, and in a minute I want to turn to examples from the web of how this is playing out, but I think what this means overall is that for many people who are information architects or they're librarians of one sort or another, they're in the business of organizing information and helping people find it, that there's a switch. Rather than trying simply to build a single universal tree of categories into which everything will fit, instead we should also be thinking about ponds, building ponds that are filled with rich information objects that have so many different ways of being found that users 50 or 100 years from now who are doing research will still be able to find what they want even though we didn't anticipate what they were looking for. And that's the challenge. So for example, going from a library card, which is packed full of data, to enriching that with as much information about that book and about the information as possible, including the author's, I'm making this up, okay, but including the author's biography, the other books the author has written, of course, the books that were written about this book that mention it, which is happening on Amazon right now, by the way. The author's social world, the author's friends and relatives and other people that he knew, because we may want to search for him that way. The content of the book itself needs to be part of this information packet. We want to be able to search through the content to find it because we want to remember, what was that book that used this phrase? And I'll just say in passing, what this means, for those of you who care, is that the difference between metadata and data, between the tag and the content, it's gone. The content now is a tag. So the content itself needs to be there. The links from the web, what everybody else on the web is saying over time dynamically is also should be part of this information object. And yes, you might as well add the kitchen sink and make sure that you make it really easy for your users to add their own information to this packet. You want stuff as rich as possible because people are not going to find it by going through a taxonomy, at least not very often. They're going to find it by searching for the data around the object. So in this world, I mean, if that's what's happening, if these four sorts of changes are happening, then what's the world going to look like? And I think you can get actually a pretty good glimpse of it because it's happening already on the web. So I want to start with what is actually a negative example, and I'm going to apologize for, because I'm going to pick on Kenmore, but for two reasons. The first is we're happy Kenmore customers, so I can give them a plug. And the second is that it's random. There's so many sites like this. Almost all commercial sites are like this. They're just truly random. So I want to tell you a story about 2 years ago when my wife and I were looking for a new washer dryer. We had it narrowed down to Maytag versus Kenmore. And so I went to the Kenmore site. And at that point, what did you see? You saw a little flash advertisement before you got to the site. And what it said was, introducing a revolutionary new washer that will change the way you think about laundry. There's no audio, but that's the voices I hear. It's sort of Walter Cronkite marries James Earl Jones. So why am I seeing this? I don't want to think about laundry. It's the whole point of fixing getting these things. I don't want to think about laundry. But somebody, a marketing person, figured, okay, we can message him real good now. So then you click through and you get to the site, and it's completely professional, typical, good-looking sort of site, no, totally without value. Not a shred of value in it. Kenmore, smart, stylish, simple. You know, it's just marketing. It's alliteration, so it's got to be marketing. And then the set of things you can do. You can click on Kenmore Promise, Kenmore Elite, trust your Kenmore IQ. That's a quiz to see if I have sufficiently absorbed the Kenmore marketing messages. Well, meanwhile, I'm trying to buy something from them. I want to buy a washing machine. I want to know if their washing machine is going to fit in the hole I just cut in my counter, and they're giving me smart, stylish, and simple. Well, you can get that information. It's 8 clicks in, but you can get it. And there it is. Very straightforward, great information. They stand behind it, that's great. It's as if they're embarrassed about it. It's as if they're ashamed of this. Totally typical of commercial sites. So I told a little lie. The little lie was that I didn't go to the Kenmore site because I knew that's what it was going to be. It didn't occur to me. So instead I went to what is every company's homepage, which is Google. Thank you very much. Yes, it's Google. I Googled Kenmore, Maytag, and discussion. I got to thathomesite.com, which is a site that's just discussion forums around household items. You type in the model number, and I found this thread, this discussion thread. Somebody says, anybody been looking at this model? And sure enough, this guy named Jim writes in and says, yeah, I have been. I looked at some competitors. We got the Kenmore. We're very happy with it. The dryer's noisier than the washer, which I hadn't ever thought about. I dried a queen-size bedspread in it. Again, I hadn't thought about it, but it's good to know. And it dried great, he says. The interesting thing to me is this guy, Jim, I believe, but if I went to the Kenmore site and it said, best of all, dries bedspreads like a dream, I wouldn't have believed it. But Jim, I believe. And it's really important to ask why that's the case. Well, he continues. He says, I'm using up my old detergents. Again, hadn't thought of that. But finishes up, he says, but oh, the buzzer on both machines. Oh, sure wish they were chimes or something. Because it turns out the done buzzer on these washer-dryer things, so loud, car alarms going off. Neighbor's cat hair is coming out. It's incredibly loud. So, this is actual knowledge. This is not stuff I'd find out any other way. This is knowledge that is embedded in the human context, how acute our hearing is, how big our houses are, how far apart our houses are from us, how important it is for us to hear about our laundry. If this were a smoke alarm, the fact that it was so loud would be great. We have to know a lot about, you have to be embedded in the human context to know that a laundry alarm can be too loud. So why do I believe Jim? And by the way, if I'd gone to the Kenmore store, I will guarantee you they would never have said, hey, you want to hear the buzzer on this baby? Just not going to come up. So this is stuff that only emerges out of the human context. So why do I believe Jim? Why is this knowledge to me? First of all, because he speaks in a human voice. He makes jokes, he misspells, his grammar's not that great, he seems to be balanced, doesn't seem to be shilling for Kenmore. Could I be wrong? Could this be a clever marketing droid from Kenmore? Theoretically, yes. No, I'm not wrong. This is a real human being. So voice. Voice is a powerful authority in this new world. And that's remarkable. Second reason is it's not just Jim. This is part of a discussion thread. So you read down, there's another 10 messages saying, oh, yeah, that buzzer's a killer. Here's what I did about it. Just have the installer snip the wires. And an installer writes in and says, no, we'll get fired. Don't even ask us. There's the authorities in the voice and the authorities in the conversation. This is the opposite of think about the encyclopedias from the 1600s. This is the opposite of that sort of authority of knowledge. You continue reading in this thread, by the way, and you come across, your front loaders leave more or less lint on clothes than top loaders. Okay? This person named Rinso, which is a little disturbing, I will admit. Rinso writes in and says, Dear Karen, because of the difference in free tumbling in water as opposed to being beaten by sharp blades, there's a physicist of lint who hangs out at this site and can't wait to jump in. There's expertise for you. There's expertise embedded in the world. So if voice and conversation are important elements of authority that are emerging in the new world of knowledge, then we have to talk about weblogs. So I'm going to. Weblogs, weblogs are blogs. They're daily journals. They are in reverse chronological order generally. That is, the new entry pushes down the old one. They're incredibly easy to update. You just type into a box and it gets published on the web. All that's true. It's not at the heart of blogs. It doesn't explain why there is so much interest in them. And I believe it is genuine interest. I think ultimately blogs are really interesting and people care about them because they are places where we get to speak in our own voice about the things that matter to us, and there's persistence. There's no real persistence to email, none to IM, none to telephone calls. There are to blogs. We write there every day, and you can come back as often as you want, and the more you read, the more you're going to know me. Weblogs are selves. That's why they matter. That's why they matter to the bloggers. That's why friendships spring up among bloggers so quickly and easily, because we already know each other. Weblogs are the way that we are constructing ourselves in this new public. We've never had a new simultaneous public before, simultaneous with the real world. Now we do, and the first thing we fill a public with is selves. And how do you do that? There has to be voice, there has to be persistence. Weblogs. We're writing ourselves into existence on the web, one blog entry at a time. But they're not just people talking about, breakfast and their cat and why they hate their teachers and the rest of that. Of course, we are talking about that too. But more important, weblogs are conversations. They are done in response frequently to other weblogs. This is Doc Searles, a well-known weblogger. This is his site. And if you notice all the blue underlined text, you can see that much of what Doc writes about are responses to other people's weblogs, and they to him. And you get these webs of conversation going. On the right-hand side is Doc's blog roll. That's a list of weblogs that Doc finds interesting and thinks you will too. So here's Doc, who's saying, here are great links, go somewhere else. Go away from my site for a while. Here's something you'll find interesting also. This is it's a little act of selflessness. It's totally common. This is how the web got built, by people linking away from themselves. It's totally common in the world of web blogs. You don't even think about, oh, I'm going to send somebody away. No, that's how your blog has value. So here's a guy who says, click here, go away from me. A little act of generosity, the exact opposite of the Kenmore site. Commercial sites don't get this. They're still interested in attracting sticky eyeballs, the most disgusting way of talking about your customers ever invented, and they don't even recognize it. So another point about weblogs that makes them important is that they're written badly. We write them every day. Some of us, the more unemployed of us, write several times a day. And if you're going to be a really good writer and polish everything you write, you're never going to get it done. You're never going to be out, your blog's never going to get published. So you have to be willing to write badly in public. Now, many of the bloggers are really good writers. Nevertheless, they're not as good as when they're writing over the course of weeks and doing something for print publication. You have to be willing to write badly. Two effects of that. One is that we get to see you a little bit more at home, a little bit more relaxed, a little bit less formal and protected, moving the line of public and private. The second thing that happens, I think, is more interesting, which is there's an ethos of forgiveness that develops. Your readers know you're writing quickly, so they don't bother writing in and saying, oh, typo, ha ha. Of course, it's a weblog. Of course there are typos in it. Of course you say things that you regret later. It's a weblog. That's the whole point. This culture of forgiveness is hugely important, and it helps explain why weblogs are able to pull people together in the way that most published writing doesn't. We've already forgiven each other. That's an act of intimacy. So what happens when there's no separation between author and work, when the line between public and private is being moved, when we see the value of the contents of what you're writing as a large part of that value being pointing away from yourself, as opposed to trying to encapsulate content, value in your content. When there's an ethos of forgiveness, when voice is connecting us, that affects knowledge. And one of the ways of talking about this is to go back to the old objectivity-subjectivity split. You know, objectivity tries to show us the world as it is, as if we weren't there observing it. Subjectivity shows us our world as it matters to us. Virtues in both, of course. When it comes to knowledge, however, subjectivity's gotten the short end of the stick. Subjectivity doesn't get any respect. Objectivity, that's where knowledge is. Knowledge, objectivity, and facts. Quite a trio. Subjectivity, yeah, it's different for each person, so it can't be knowledge. It's too miscellaneous. So here's what I think is happening. We have weblogs that are in conversation with one another across time and space. Let's say your topic that you're interested in is forgiveness, okay? Now, I could send you to some authoritative works on the topic, perhaps. You could go to an encyclopedia, you could find an expert. Or you could go to Google, and you could Google forgiveness. You might even add the word blogs, but Google likes blogs. But there's an ugly sentence just in terms of the sonic sound of it. Google likes blogs, so you're likely to get some blogs when you do the search. You Google for forgiveness, maybe you'll find my friend Akma. AKMA. He's a theologian at a small seminary outside of Chicago. He wrote some brilliant stuff about forgiveness. People responded to him. So you go read Akma's stuff, and you'll see links going in and out. People looked at what Akma said, other bloggers, and said, well, that's really interesting, but I think it's right, I think it's wrong, I like this, I didn't like that, here's how it looks from a Buddhist point of view, I'm a Jew, here's how it looks from a Jewish point of view, and the person over here responds in her blog to that person over there, who responds to that person, and this messy web of links that nobody could ever traverse emerges. And if you go and you start with Akma or any of the links and start following them, you'll get multiple views, subjective views about what forgiveness means. And not only that, you'll get them in conversation with one another. And we've never, ever had that before. And that's a type of multi-subjectivity that's giving subjectivity some of the heft that expert-controlled, authoritative objectivity has reserved for itself. And there's an enormous eruption of joy on the web that we are able to do that. Wikipedia, remember Wikipedia from the beginning? It's a very constrained medium. They're very careful. It tries for objectivity. Nevertheless, even there's a tremendous upsurge of joy that we are able to do this. We are able to write our own encyclopedia. We've wrested the encyclopedia out of the hands of the experts, out of the hands of the Britannicas. Nothing wrong with Britannica. That's theirs. This is ours. We haven't had that before. So what's the shape of knowledge? Trees are in trouble. Trees are always going to be useful. They're an amazing way of compressing thought. They are incredibly useful for traversing large, complex subject matters, but the dream of a universal tree of knowledge, of a set of categories into which we can then slot things, that dream, I believe, is dead. And instead, knowledge is beginning to look more like this tangle, this messy, organic tangle that's growing bottom up, that's viney, that's dark, that's ambiguous, that nobody can ever traverse entirely, that whose value comes from the fact that it cannot be encapsulated, that it's busted out of the vine, out of the bonds, that it's growing without any plan, that it's growing through links and through human interest around things that matter to us, the things that matter to us as embodied individuals. This is so far from Dewey that it's unimaginable. This is the reaction against 2,500 years of attempts to provide knowledge through constructing trees, through trees of categories. Now, Aristotle, way at the beginning, believed that knowledge was only knowledge if it reflected the way the world looks. That if knowledge, actually knowledge and world are the same organizing principles. And what I want to suggest by way of ending is that's exactly what we see happening here. That this tangled, viney, inchoate mass that can't ever be articulated fully or traversed fully or contained fully, that this is a better representation of our world than any category tree could ever be. And that furthermore, that this is the only way of understanding our world which allows us to live in a pluralistic, diverse world together. Thank you. Whatever, yeah, of course.
Stand here. Thank you very much. That was provocative and entertaining and thoroughly delightful, and I'm glad the pictures were finally available. That made a big difference too. We're now going to hear very brief